What are the benefits in sex education?
And our parole system, putting repeat offenders back on the streets of America. Murderers, rapists, does it make any sense? Outraged victims demand answers.
But I'd like for someone to tell me why, and someone on the parole board to tell me why they let these people out.
Who I am now is very much different than who I was at the time that I committed these crimes.
But will they strike again? Geraldo Rivera, taking a look at America's time bomb.
Chris, how you doing? I'm Teddy.
Teddy Kennedy Jr., an heir to the Kennedy legend, stricken with cancer as a child.
And I really couldn't think of living my life with one leg.
But he fought back, controlled his destiny, and now brings hope to others, helping the disabled with his own very special personal touch.
Up front tonight, criminals out on parole and the threat that holds for each of us. What does parole mean? Well, for convicts, it means out. For the government, it's often a quick fix for overcrowded prisons. But what about for you and me? Does it mean repeat offenders are back on the streets? Well, crime rates are down, and the war on crime has put more people in jail. But the flip side is that as more criminals are squeezed into prison, others are squeezed out. And the question remains, are they really ready to find a place in society? Geraldo Rivera has been looking into today's parole system, and what he found might make you wonder whether there's any system at all.
Parole. These lawmen near Los Angeles are setting out to deal with one of the failures of the system. A parolee, a convict released from prison on the condition that he goes straight, has instead returned to crime, violated parole. So joined by uniformed cops carrying shotguns and wearing bulletproof vests, the parole officers have the job of finding the guy and putting him back behind bars.
Tell her what you want to take.
My Levi's, shoes, some socks.
Caught using and selling heroin, Jimmy Jimenez is going back to prison. But listen as his parole officer reads his rap sheet, his criminal record, and then ask yourself if Jimmy Jimenez ever should have been granted parole in the first place.
Assault intent to commit rape, sent to state prison, paroled to L.A. County. Burglary, rape, assaults, shots fired. He was paroled April 6th, 84. He'd been out about 7 weeks.
A lot of people these days are asking hard questions about crime and about our system of punishment. Does it work? Are we really making criminals pay? Or have our overcrowded prisons become just revolving doors that temporarily hold and then prematurely release dangerous convicts because there's no room to keep them? In other words, are prisoners getting out on parole because they have done something right or because the system has done something wrong? There are now more than 450,000 people in American prisons, twice as many as there were just 10 years ago. And as you can imagine, most of them want out on parole. What do you guys think of parole?
We want parole because they're giving us too much time. I mean, 15 to life. You know, how can a man do 15 years, you know?
Prisoners always want out. But in a society recently obsessed with law and order, there's also tremendous pressure to keep criminals in longer, punishing them for what they've done and protecting the rest of us during the time they're locked up. Parole is a way out, a system that in one form or another allows an early release. Looking like the big house in a Cagney movie, Folsom Prison in Northern California is one unit of the largest state system in the country. Typical of the situation nationwide, California's prisons are jammed, holding more than 50% over their registered capacity. That raises the question of whether or not people are getting out on parole because there's no longer room to keep them. Prison Captain Ted Zink.
Well, we have to examine all our alternatives to deal with the overcrowding, and when possible, release is one factor that's considered, yes.
How do you think the general population, the people outside of prison, would react listening to that?
Well, it's simply reality. We have to use all possible factors to deal with the overcrowding, and release is one of those.
I would like to know why. I mean, I know there's no sense in it, but I'd like for someone to tell me why. And then someone on the parole board to tell me why they let these people out. I'd like an answer.
2 years ago, Kay Brenneman's 12-year-old son Benjamin was sexually molested, then brutally murdered by a man who was out on parole. On parole despite a 21-year criminal history, and despite the fact that he had very nearly killed his last victim.
He almost killed the last child. All his records showed his potential danger.
Does the system seem to have logic in it to you?
No. Not at all. I just can't fathom it. It's beyond my comprehension. And what scares me is how many more like that are walking around.
Mrs. Brenneman raises a valid point. Most criminals commit more than one crime. And across the country, ex-cons are violating parole at a rate higher than ever before, making the revolving door from prison to the streets and back to prison all too predictable. It's a pattern that LAPD detective Jim Vucic sees over and over again.
They get back on the street and they're into narcotics, theft, robbery, whatever his specialty is.
The case of this man, Robert William Cozy Jr., seems to illustrate the detective's point. A career criminal most recently in for armed robbery, Cozy was paroled from Folsom Prison at the end of March. Like many parolees, he had to submit to a weekly urinalysis test for drugs, a frequent condition of parole. The cops who knew Cozy was once a junkie discovered he was using drugs again.
He's going to the passenger side of his car.
So a special team of detectives from the LAPD put Cozy under surveillance. That's him getting into the pickup. And they allowed 2020's cameras to follow along. Everywhere Cozy went, he was tailed.
It's going to be westbound on Integer now.
A drug habit is an expensive mistress. You don't usually pay for it with a 9-to-5 job. The officers were convinced it was only a matter of days, maybe even hours, before Cozy would revert to his specialty, armed robbery. That made any place he stopped a potential target.
Set up to go westbound on Trask.
By 3 in the afternoon, the parolee was at this market. No dice. Cozy was just shopping for beer.
Got a couple sixers and a bag.
And he was soon back on the prowl. He spent much of the day just driving around. The cops told us he was probably casing several potential targets.
Here he comes. Okay, he's westbound.
The surveillance continued into night. By 8 o'clock, the officers watched from across the street as Cozy met a couple of friends outside a bar.
Okay, some conversation has been overheard. They're talking about going someplace to do something.
When the con got to a 7-Eleven all-night market, a favorite target of armed robbers, the officers were almost certain this was it.
Okay, he's into the store.
You can actually see the clerk facing Cozy across the counter.
Jim, I can see the clerk really good. Bagging something up for him. The hands are still down on the clerk, so it looks okay.
But once again, for some reason, Cozy didn't go for it. But remember, he's a junkie, a time bomb who needs money for dope. And by this time, he must have been getting pretty desperate. The cops know it's going to happen, and when Cozy beats them through a traffic signal, the 5 cars now tailing him have to weave their way through the red light to catch up.
We're coming, Mikey. About a block and a half behind you.
After some erratic driving, Cozy picked out this bar. He was wearing a ski mask, and he was armed with a gun, which the cops will refer to in their jargon as his lunch.
He's looking at the rear door real hard, checking the exits. He's stashing what appears to be a lunch.
To avoid blowing their surveillance and for the safety of the camera crew, we were ordered to stay a couple of blocks away.
Get on there, Van. You're about a block from him, and he's ready to caper.
Caper. It's another police term for committing a crime. Remember, the cops are dealing with a dangerous, violent junkie with a gun. But we were able to listen to what was going on.
Walking up to the door. Stand by. He's walking back towards his car. He's heading home. He definitely went to his waistband for a lunch and was pulling the mask down.
But after walking through the bar with the mask out and the gun ready, Cozy was interrupted by an alert bartender who locked him outside the back door.
I asked him, "What the hell are you doing?" And he went like this. He says, "I got to take a pee." So then I knew something was wrong, so I left the back door locked.
By 1 in the morning, Cozy was at home, but these cops couldn't leave him there. He was armed, dangerous, and had allegedly attempted to stick up that bar. So they decided to arrest Cozy at his home.
When you step through the door, you step immediately to the right is his bedroom. Okay. There's a window on the driveway that you're vulnerable from.
Okay, here's a cap. Here's a ski mask.
That's it? Yeah. That's it?
The cops say Cozy refused to follow their orders, hands up in the air. So they knocked him in the head with one of their flashlights. The next day, he was transferred out of the medical ward and booked into jail. But wasn't it all so predictable?
I think it goes far beyond prediction. It's almost certainty that when he came out of prison, that Mr. Cozy was going to go back to committing armed robberies. Mr. Cozy will be violated, stand trial for the robberies that we were able to make on him, go back to state prison, get back out, and probably commit more armed robberies.
On the Robert Cozy matter?
Yes. In Robert Cozy's case, one thing is certain. The alleged ski mask bandit is going back to prison for violating his parole at least, and if convicted, for stealing a gun and attempting armed robbery as well. But the sheer predictability of Cozy's caper raises critical questions about the parole system. Was the original sentence appropriate? And should Cozy and others like him have been on parole in the first place?
Aside from the fact that the prison sentence doesn't always fit the criminal, and that parole is often granted to prisoners the cops are almost sure are going to get out of jail to commit more crime, there are other serious problems with the parole system. Look, for instance, at this computer printout, obtained by 2020. It's 75 feet long, and what it contains are the names of 4,000 parolees who are currently fugitives from the law, and this is just in the state of California. 4,000 parolees with such utter contempt for the system that they don't even bother reporting to their parole officers. 4,000 convicts who've been released from prison and who are now out there, unsupervised, and who may be living next door to you. It's a common problem nationwide. Howard Miller runs the parole system in the state of California.
I'm holding a computer printout of 4,000 fugitives.
Right.
4,000 parolees who have run.
Right.
4,000 criminals who are out there, unsupervised, uncontrolled, and, for all we know, committing new offenses. Isn't this printout evidence of serious problems in the parole system?
No, I would not say it was a serious problem. Many of these people, when we find them, they're holding down full-time jobs. They've not broken any law. The only rule they've broken is they didn't report to us. And we have to deal with that. So each one who's running is not involved in criminal activity.
Okay, Ruben, nice and easy.
But clearly many of them are. Until he was surrounded by a police SWAT team, for example, Ruben Diaz was on that long computer list, passing part of his time as a parole fugitive, taking pistol shots at passing cars in this Los Angeles neighborhood.
The laws governing parole are different from one state to the next. In some jurisdictions, for example, inmates are released automatically when their time is up. In other states, however, they have to go before a parole board, which decides whether or not to release them early. In the state of California, only inmates serving life sentences, like 28-year-old Glenn O'Connor, have to go before a parole board.
You were sentenced to death.
Yes.
Many people would argue that it is a tragedy that that sentence was never carried out. Yes. And yet you still think that you want out.
Yes.
And that you deserve out.
Yes.
Let me read something from one of the letters you gave me, Glenn. This one is from the Office of the District Attorney in Orange County. He's quoting some of your previous behavior. He robbed an elderly woman at her residence, forced her to lie on her bed, and executed her in cold blood. Within weeks in the same neighborhood, attempted to execute an elderly man who he also robbed and forced to lie on his bed. Miraculously, the victim, though shot in the head, grievously wounded, survived. O'Connor netted $2 in the robbery. Now, why in the world should the state of California ever even consider you eligible for parole? Well, who I am now is very much different than who I was at the time that I committed these crimes. There's such a difference between who I was then and who I am now that it's almost as if someone else had committed these crimes. Do you believe that you deserve parole? Look in the crystal ball now. What's your prediction on what the parole board does or says next time, time after that, whatever? It's almost guaranteed they will find me unsuitable for parole. Ever? No, just right now. Do you think it's possible that you may someday be released? Yes. Maybe sooner than anyone else thinks.
Even before O'Connor ever killed anyone, his prison psychiatrist predicted correctly that it was just a matter of time. Well, another report, ironically by the very same psychiatrist, brings us to perhaps the most dramatic recent case, illustrating the lack of logic or common sense in parole laws. It involves a convicted California killer named Raymond Louis George. Let me read to you from a recent psychiatric evaluation. Quote, "When talking with Mr. George, one gets the impression of a predatory animal, waiting for the right time to strike again, to bring about the destruction of another victim. It is my belief that this man will kill again, if released to the streets. Well, after serving just 8.5 years in prison for murder and other crimes, Raymond Louis George is about to be released to the streets on parole in about 10 days. His story is so notorious, they teach it to young recruits coming on the job.
Fast, seat. That is.
And we're looking right now at the release of a man by the name of Raymond Louis George. And
George's first victim was a 19-year-old college student he hacked with a hatchet. After nearly killing the young woman, George lured a couple of LA cops with a phony call about a suspicious character. As the cops got close, George grabbed one of their weapons.
Shoved it into the stomach of Officer Van Pelt and pulled the trigger. Van Pelt relates that it felt as if his insides exploded. And he released Raymond Louis George, who escaped at that point in time. Raymond Louis George then came in contact with the LA County Sheriff's Department. Once again, he had summoned them to his location, and upon arrival,
he turned and he spit in my face. I stepped back a little bit, and as I did so, he gave one of these karate yells and went into an offensive stance. All this time, he's kicking at us, trying to pull his hands free, and he's screaming. It seemed like he was just in kind of a frenzy.
Arrested, then released on bail 2 weeks later, George again got close to a cop, a 21-year-old state policeman named David Jack. This time, George shot the officer in the head and killed him.
I was amazed, and I was really in shock that we had arrested a person who had done all these heinous crimes, and I was extremely frightened.
After killing the state policeman, George almost got officers Paul Doman and John Bell. He grappled with both of them and grabbed for their weapons, tearing at their right hips. But since both men are lefties, their holsters were on the other side, and George came up empty-handed. How do you feel about the fact that this guy is getting out on parole?
I can't believe it. I'm between shocked and I'm angry. After shooting 2 police officers, killing 1 police officer, taking a machete and viciously attacking a female on a college campus, he's getting out, and he's going to be in society again. And there's no doubt in my mind that he probably will do it again.
So Raymond Louis George is getting out on parole because the law says he's done his time. But why can't this convicted cop killer now be committed to a mental institution as a danger to himself and the rest of society? You see, earlier this year, right here in LA County Jail, he had a psychiatric breakdown. He was out of control, so violent that they had to strap him down for several days. And yet, according to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, that incident last February is not enough to commit him now. Yes, he may have been violent and psychotic back then, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's still dangerous today.
We don't know what he's going to do on parole. We have no idea.
Parole officers Alan Cleveland and Hugh Alcott have the unenviable job of supervising Raymond George when he is paroled just a week and a half from now. Remember, that release is mandatory. The law says he must be let go. Are we, in essence, releasing a time bomb onto the streets with a very short fuse?
I'd say that was a reasonable statement, yes. I'm hoping it never goes off or never gets lit. But given the facts we have, that's all we can do is hope.
If I saw the man again on the street, and he came at me in such a way as I thought my life was threatened, well, then I'd have to do what I have to do to protect myself. Knowing this man and knowing what kind of individual he was, you know, I'd probably have to shoot him. The only thing that makes me angry is the judicial system. Why are they making me the executioner? How can you conceivably say this guy's rehabilitated? It's an obvious farce, and it's going to be played on us.
Geraldo, this man, George, gets out September 30th. That's a week and a half away. Now, this is obviously wrong. What does one do to change the parole system?
The first thing you do is you take all the experts and say, you fellows go and wait in another building, because the person with the most standing, the person who should be testifying as to whether or not someone gets parole, is the survivor of the victim. It's the mother of the 12-year-old boy who was molested and then murdered, torture murdered by someone who had done it before. It's the co-ed whose eye was chopped out by Raymond Louis George. Let them be the primary witnesses to decide whether or not someone gets parole. The second thing you do is when someone is so utterly predictable in terms of their future criminal behavior, you sentence them to prison longer. You keep them in longer. You selectively incapacitate them, in the words of the Rain Corporation.
Let the punishment fit the crime.
Let the punishment fit the crime and protect people who are law-abiding. You know, we put people in prison to punish them and to protect the rest of us.
Thank you, Geraldo. We'll see if there are any changes. It certainly is complicated and complex and a desperate situation as it stands now. Hugh?
Thank you, Barbara and Geraldo. Well, next, sex education. Today's kids are learning everything, but parents are wondering whether it's really paying off. Tom Jarrell with a report right after this.